Welcome to the secret of America. Here, we uncover stories that linger in shadows too dark for the light of day. My father left me a box. He told me never to open it before I died. He passed away in 1987, just as I was about to turn 17. And, for decades, the box remained unopened in the corner of a dusty attic, beneath the creaking beams of the old family home. It was only recently, when the house itself seemed to whisper its secrets louder in my ears, that I felt the need to speak of it. To tell you what I discovered and what it meant. At first glance, the box was unremarkable, worn oak-stained deep sepia, iron clasps dulled by age, and a padlock that resisted every key I could find. Yet inside was a world no one intended me to enter. Before we go there, remember to subscribe to the channel if you value these glimpses into histories sealed by fear and silence. The town where I grew up is called Ashborough, a small New England hamlet at the end of a winding dirt road framed by ancient oaks whose limbs twist like grasping hands, their leaves whispering stories only the wind can understand. Outside, the air held that damp chill of early autumn, soaked by rains that turned the dirt path into a slick mirror reflecting the dim glow of gas lamps still clinging stubbornly to a fading era. The houses carried the weight of another century, steep gabled roofs casting long shadows, chimneys reaching like bony fingers against the slate, gray sky. My family home sat at the village edge, a Victorian mansion with shuttered windows and a wrap-around porch sagging under years of neglect. Inside, the scent of aged cedar and mothballs greeted anyone who dared cross the threshold, mingling with something else. A faint metallic tang I could never place as a child, something cold and distant, as if the house itself breathed a secret in its sleep. I was the only child of Richard and Eleanor Mallory, a family name once whispered with reverence in Ashborough for its old money and standing. Father was a tall, gaunt man with silver, streaked hair, his hands perpetually stained with ink and grease from tinkering in the small workshop beneath the basement. His eyes were pale, almost glassy, and they held a weight, an unreadable endurance. Mother, silent and always dressed in muted grays, carried the kind of sorrow that filled rooms with winter. Father had locked away many things: letters, photographs faded by time, and that box sealed with the sternest warning I had ever heard. The first seed of wrongness in this tale came not from the box, but from a memory I buried deep a late autumn night when thunder crashed as if the sky itself were breaking, and Father called me downstairs in a voice so low and urgent it sent chills down my spine. The basement workshop was a shrine of shadows, lit only by the flicker of a single incandescent bulb hanging from the low ceiling. The walls were lined with wooden crates and shelves cluttered with mechanical parts, old clocks, and glass jars that caught the amber light in eerie ways. He held up the box then, a younger version, locked tight and ominous. "Do not open this before I am gone," he said, his voice rough and desperate, as if the box contained some peril too vast to name. At the time, I nodded without fully understanding. The truth, as it turned out, was far worse than anyone imagined. Ashborough had its own history, not the kind shared in town meetings or written in neat lines in county archives. Beneath its respectable surface lurked stories drowned in whispered fears and names erased by time. The Mallory family was no exception. Our lineage traced back to the 1870s when my great-great-grandfather, Jeremiah Mallory, built the mansion as a statement of wealth and permanence, a gleaming symbol of Victorian pride. Yet, Jeremiah was said to have been a man of terrible disposition, prone to fits of rage that left the household trembling. Neighbors spoke in hushed tones of strange noises from the estate, shrieks that pierced the night and shadows moving against the wind. What no one knew at the time was that Jeremiah kept a locked room in the mansion's west wing. a room no one was allowed to enter. The key vanished from family records after his sudden death, which coincided oddly with the mysterious disappearance of his wife, Clara. Years later, when the records were finally unsealed, I found myself haunted by the connection, a thread leading me toward the box, and the secrets Father tried to bury. I was 26 when I returned to Ashboro after Father's funeral. The mansion had grown colder in his absence, the floorboards groaning under the weight of silence. I began clearing out his belongings, hoping to sell the estate, but the box always drew me back, its surface worn yet unyielding, as if it possessed its own heartbeat. One evening, as twilight sprawled across the valley and the scent of decayed leaves filled the air, I noticed something peculiar. The thick velvet curtains in the parlor, a room I rarely entered, partially obscured a wall panel that did not align perfectly with the others. A faint draft escaped from its edges, carrying that same metallic scent Father feared. The house groaned in the growing wind, and I pressed my ear to the panel, catching a hollow whisper like breath trapped on the other side. That discovery unsettled me, but I told myself it was nothing. Yet each night thereafter, strange things began stirring. The faint patter of footsteps in the attic when the house was empty, the slow creak of wooden stairs that should have been still, and once, a murmur soft and urgent from the shadows, as if the mansion itself sought to speak. My mother's letters, tucked away in the attic beneath layers of dust, told a story of quiet dread she had written to a distant relative during those last months before Father's death, hinting at a secret that gnawed at their sanity, something sealed tight in the box and more ancient than our family's legacy. Her words were frantic, filled with references to a curse whispered by old town elders and binding oaths murmured in blood. Before she could explain fully, she too passed away, leaving only fragmented warnings behind. The box, when examined closely, bore strange carvings, swirling glyphs that did not match any traditional alphabet, edged by signs that seemed ritualistic. Father had scribbled notes in the margins of his journals, cryptic references to the pact, the Watchers, and the price of knowledge. None of this made sense until I found a faded newspaper clipping dated October 10, 1987, the day my father died. It described a fire at the edge of Ashboro, near the old Ashworth estate, a sprawling ruin abandoned for decades. But buried within the report was an eerie oddity, a section blacked out, replaced by the words, classified and forbidden. The town's public records were frustratingly vague on the matter. Intrigued, I sought out the local historical society, where an elderly librarian named Mrs. Grayson remembered my family well, speaking in tones marked by both respect and fear. She revealed a lesser-known chapter. The Mallory family had long been entangled with the Ashworths, a family whose name was synonymous with tragedy and whispered curses dating back to the early days of the settlement. The Ashworth estate had burned to the ground under mysterious circumstances shortly after my father's death, and rumors suggested the fire was not accidental. What happened next defies any rational explanation. One night, as I sat poring over Father's journals beneath the dim flicker of a kerosene lamp, I heard the distinct sound of the box shifting on the attic floor. I had moved it there from the basement, but no earthly force should have caused it to move on its own. Heart pounding, I climbed the stairs and approached it, the air thick with a cold that bit through layers of wool. The box was slightly open, just a crack, as if beckoning me to peer inside. My hands trembled, but I forced myself to step back. The horrible truth was settling in. The box was not simply a container of relics or letters. It was a boundary, a prison for something long forgotten, something my father had tried to contain. In the days that followed, the house seemed to contract around me, shrinking and darkening, as though a malevolent presence had reclaimed it. Objects I had moved were found in different rooms, and the whispering grew louder, snatches of voices speaking in languages I could not hope to understand. And then the phone rang at midnight, a shrill cry tearing through the silence. When I answered, there was only a breath on the other end, a breath that carried the unmistakable scent of rust and decay. The final shiver came when I discovered an old photograph, tucked beneath the floorboards in the attic. It was a grainy image of my father, much younger, standing beside a man I did not recognize. A stranger whose eyes glimmered with something unnatural, and whose shadow stretched too long for the fading light. My father's expression was not the stern, quiet man I remembered, but one twisted with despair and dread. Beneath the photo was a hastily scrawled message in father's hand, open at the end. And so here I sit, whispering this to you, because the box remains unopened, and I still live, though the days grow shorter, and the nights heavier. The inheritance my father left me was never just the house or its decay, but this terrible obligation to keep the box sealed until the moment I die. What they found behind that door changed everything, not just for my family, but perhaps for the fate of Ashborough itself. You may think this is the end, but it is only the beginning. Never before has anyone spoken openly of the Mallory Box, and for good reason. The shadows waiting beyond the lock are patient. They have been waiting a lifetime. Now, as the wind howls and the rain drums against the glass panes like a summons, I wonder how much longer I can resist opening what should never be seen. This is my story. The hour grows late, and the box rests just out of reach on the dusty floorboards. Welcome to the ghastly journal, and sleep well. Remember, some doors are meant to stay closed. The attic was colder than before, the air heavier, as I returned to that narrow, shadowed space where the box had chosen to move on its own. It sat there, half open, just enough to tease. The dark grooves of its carvings caught the meager light with unsettling subtlety. The scent of rust and decay drifted from it like a foul breath, and I could almost hear the old house itself sighing in resignation. Despite every instinct screaming for restraint, I needed to know more. What was hidden so fiercely that my father's last gasps were spent warning me of the cost? I began my descent back into the history I thought I had only begun to uncover. There was tension in the air, a gathering storm outside that matched the turmoil within. My first step was to seek those who might remember more about the Mallory legacy, those still alive, whose voices had not been stilled by time or fear. I visited the village pub, a dim wood, paneled room where the hazy smoke hung eternally just above the worn mahogany bar. Old-timers gathered there on slow afternoons, nursing drinks as the rain tapped against the window panes, like distant fingers of unwelcome inquiry. I found a man named Ezekiel Parsons who had lived in Ashborough longer than anyone else this side of the turn of the century. His face was lined with years and regret, but his eyes gleamed with the sharpness of one who remembers things others wish to forget. When I showed him an old photograph of my father standing beside the strange man, he stiffened. "That shadow," he said, "looked like Silas Thorne, the man who vanished from Ashborough nearly 30 years before in what was called a disappearance, but everyone here knew was far darker. Silas Thorne was a figure steeped in local legend and occultist, some called him. A madman, others whispered, but none doubted he had meddled in forces best left alone. Parsons leaned in, lowering his voice to a whisper almost drowned by the hum of the rain. He told me the story of the Oakwood Covenant, a secret pact formed between the Mallorys, the Ashworths, and a handful of others in Ashborough's earliest days. It was said to be a binding agreement promising prosperity in exchange for silence and sacrifice. Sacrifices that were never spoken aloud, but marked in blood and shadow. Evidence of the pact's longevity could be found woven through Ashborough's history. Inexplicable wealth, untimely deaths, disappearances, and the ever-present shadow of the Ashworth estate, burnt not by accident, but by design. Parsons' testimony was a key turning point. He claimed the box was not just a vessel. It was, in fact, a seal. Inside lay the remnants of this covenant's darkest dealings, and the consequences should it ever be broken were unspeakable. To prove his point, he handed me a brittle, yellowed ledger he had kept. Entries in a cramped, archaic script dating back to 1899. The ledger chronicled ritual dates, names of those called, and accounts of strange phenomena. Animals found mutilated, children disappearing in the woods, fires breaking out in impossible ways. I traced trembling fingers over a name inked repeatedly: Clara Mallory, my great-great-grandmother, whose disappearance coincided, oddly, with the start of the Ashworth estate's long decay. But it was the last entry that chilled me most, a notation beneath the date of October 10th, 1987, the very day of my father's death. The script was hurried, almost frantic. The seal weakens. The price is near. All must not pass beyond. I sought out the Ashborough Historical Society the following day. Its aging brick building, a narrow needle bent beneath the weight of years. There Mrs. Grayson awaited, her hands shaking slightly as she unfolded a cache of documents she had hidden away from public view for decades. Among these, I found corroboration of Parsons' stories, and something else. Court transcripts from the nights leading up to the Ashworth estate fire. Eyewitnesses spoke of strange chanting heard on the wind, figures cloaked in black moving through the ruins, and apparitions seen flickering in the flames, lettered tongues. These testimonies had been dismissed, buried by those wishing to keep the old order intact, or perhaps genuinely unable to comprehend what had transpired. But what no one knew at the time was that, during one of these trials, a man named Nathaniel Ashworth confessed to something hideous. He spoke of the warden, locked beyond the box, an ancient evil bound by blood and steel, demanding escalating tribute lest it be released. The name was never recorded fully, only fragments surviving, a cursed name lost to fear and rash penmanship. I asked Mrs. Grayson if any physical evidence remained from the Ashworth fire or its victims. She hesitated, then produced a small glass vial containing a fine black ash, said to have come directly from the hearth where the flames originated. I held it up to the light. The dust swirled like smoke trapped in time, poisonous and ancient. The implication was unbearable. My father's death had been no accident. There was a price to pay for knowledge, and it had been exacted with surgical precision. One afternoon, I uncovered another unexpected witness in an unlikely place, a retired firefighter named Harold Jensen, who had been among the first responders at the Ashworth estate fire. His recollection was fragmented, worn down by years and the weight of unspoken horror, but he recalled seeing something no one else claimed. The fully intact Mallory box sitting amongst the rubble, untouched by flame and ice cold to the touch despite the surrounding heat. Upon returning to the Mallory estate, I took to inspecting the house with fresh eyes. Or rather, eyes grown hungry for other truths. The dim rooms and creaking staircases seemed less like relics of the past and more like passages into a worsening present. I found a hidden drawer beneath the floorboards in Father's study containing a diary he had kept during his final months. The entries were cryptic but vividly painted his despair. He wrote of shadows encroaching, of voices whispering promises and threats in equal measure, of a consuming darkness he struggled to contain. One entry spoke bluntly, "They watch, always watch." The final lines were a scrawl, a desperate warning that said, "Do not falter. Do not open. Keep the bloodline sealed, or all is lost. That phrase, keep the bloodline sealed, gnawed at me as I pulled thread after thread of this grim tapestry. It suggested that the curse, if curse it was tied not only to the box, but to our lineage itself. The Mallory name was both shield and shackles. One evening, I decided to visit the local church cemetery, hoping to find solace among the quiet stones. Amid the rows of weathered headstones, I found one belonging to Clara Mallory, the name almost erased by centuries, but still legible. She was buried alone, the markers around her gravesite disturbed. The earth uneven, as if something restless had been trying to claw its way free. Nearby lay markers belonging to the Ashworth family, similarly unmarked by time, but haggard and worn as though haunted by unseen weight. A sudden chill swept the grounds, a wind rising from nowhere, cold enough to bite through thick coats, and I heard a soft murmur carried on the breeze, a whisper that might have been my name. I turned sharply, but saw only the skeletal outlines of the oaks, their limbs like frozen shadows. The night deepened into a darkness that swallowed light and sound alike. I hurried home with the firm belief that whatever cursed bond existed between the Mallory and Ashworth families was more than folklore. It was an active force, rooted in ancient rites and forgotten promises. Days later, while sifting through Father's journals once again, I stumbled across sketches, crude designs of dark figures bound by chains, faces contorted in agony and rage. Among these drawings was a page written in a language I could not identify, but Father had translated fragments in the margins. Sentinel, Watcher, and Keeper of the Threshold. The implication was clear: the box was not only a prison, but a warning. A threshold keeping something sinister tethered. What happened next defies any rational explanation. On a particularly storm-ridden night, the ground beneath the west wing shifted slightly, producing a dull thud like the sound of earth settling over something buried. I felt compelled to investigate. Beneath the floorboards of the west wing's hallway, I uncovered a panel nearly seamless with the others, but slightly warped with age. Behind it was a narrow staircase descending sharply into darkness. As the lamp flame quivered, I descended, each step heavier with cold and dread. The tunnel led to a small subterranean chamber, locked by a rusted iron door bearing strange runes. The same symbols carved into the box. Heart hammering, I felt an oppressive weight press down, a suffocating cold like dead hands reaching from the shadows. Inside lay scattered relics, shards of broken mirrors, dried herbs twisted with rot, scraps of parchment stained by time and blood. A journal rested on a stone pedestal. It was my great-great-grandfather Jeremiah's, the writing shaky, yet unmistakably his own. The entries described a desperate attempt to appease a growing darkness through rites older than the town itself. Jeremiah confessed to binding a terrible entity beneath the house, an entity demanding increasingly dreadful offerings. Human sacrifices veiled beneath layers of lies and silence. He wrote of Clara's disappearance as a sacrifice, and the room he sealed to hide the truth. Jeremiah's voice grew frantic, warning future generations that the price of breaking the covenant would be eternal darkness, falling across the land like a wave of unbreathable night. I sat amidst the gloom, the weight of centuries pressing in, and realized the box was merely a key, a sealed promise that could unleash horrors beyond imagining. No one in the town ever spoke of it again until now. Returning from the chamber, I was met by an unexpected visitor, Marjorie Wells, a librarian and childhood acquaintance who claimed to have some knowledge of the Mallory curse. She showed me letters written by my mother, Alina, exchanges with women in town who had formed a clandestine circle known only as the Watchers. These women had sworn to protect the secret and guard the box, and Alina's own letters hinted at her growing terror as the years passed and the darkness crept closer. One letter, dated just weeks before my father's death, spoke of a figure emerging from the shadows, an ancient sentinel bound to our bloodline, now restless and demanding reckoning. Marjorie whispered that the Watchers knew the truth, but feared the day the bloodline failed to contain the evil. They had hoped I would never reach this point. It was the first major disturbing truth. I was the last Mallory, the final seal holding at bay, an ancient entity bound to my family by a covenant sealed in blood and despair. The box was not just an heirloom. It was a prison, and I was its unwilling warden. As the days bled into nights thick with unspeakable whispers, the house seemed to pulse with a life of its own. Doors slammed without wind, shadows gathered and dispersed like living things, and the once faint metallic scent thickened into a pungent iron rapture that clawed at my sanity. Strangely, the local constable, a man named Harris, began appearing more often, his eyes wary yet resolute. When I confronted him, he admitted that the police had long heard rumors about the Mallorys and Ashworths, but the town had collectively buried the facts under layers of fear and superstition. He warned me that others in Ashborough were watching now, forces both human and darker, waiting for a slip, a break in the seal. One evening, as dusk blew into night, a soft knocking came at the door. Opening it revealed an elderly woman draped in black, eyes like polished obsidian that seemed to see not just me, but the very soul beneath. She said only this: "It's been waiting for you. Do what your father could not. Seal it again, or unleash hell." The woman vanished into the gathering mist before I could ask more. Her words echoed, a siren call and a doom intertwined. I wrestled with the unbearable knowledge that opening the box might unleash unimaginable horrors, but never opening it could mean living a life shadowed by dread and relentless watchers. The walls of the house seemed to close in, the nights unbearably long and oppressive. Then, the final twist came and reframed everything I thought I knew. Among Father's old papers, hidden deep within a false bottom of his desk drawer, I found an aged leather, bound book sealed with the same iron clasps as the box. Its pages were brittle but legible, revealing a family journal that chronicled not only the curse, but an alternative history, one sealed away by Father himself. Inside, I read that the box was not originally intended to imprison evil. Instead, it was a vessel created to protect something far worse, a force of pure chaos, unknowable and vast, that had once nearly consumed Ashborough and sought escape in the form of the Sentinel. The entity beneath the house was a guardian, bound to an ancient covenant, meant to protect the world from an even darker fate. The blood sacrifices and bindings were grotesque, lies told to mask the true purpose, containment of madness beyond understanding. My father's true fear had been that releasing the box's seal might free a force meant to be a protector, but corrupted into something terrifying. The box was both prison and key, guardian and doom. I sat there, the air thick and trembling, realizing my father's warning had hidden a double-edged truth. To open the box was not only to risk releasing a curse, but possibly breaking the chain that kept utter annihilation at bay. The weight of the inheritance crushed me. The Mallory legacy was no simple family curse, but a complex balance between devastation and salvation, between darkness and a terrible, terrible light. The house exhaled around me, its breath cold and dying. I dared not sleep, for dreams now held shapes that licked at the edges of sanity. The Watchers were no longer distant whispers, but palpable presences waiting, patient beyond reason. And yet the box still sat unopened. A silent sentinel on the attic floor, waiting for me to decide what nightmare would come first, the unbinding or the waiting. The terrible weight of truth did not come in a slow, creeping dawn, but in a shattering descent. The moment when all the pieces shattered into shards too jagged to hold. The box had always been more than wood and iron. It was a living knot of despair, a beacon calling to shadows older than Ashborough itself, and worse, it had called to me. That night, when the storm reached its rancid crescendo, and wind tore at the shingles like cracking bones, I heard the box whisper again, not as a murmured threat or a sigh of dread, but as a stark calling. Something was stirring beneath the floor, deeper than the house, beneath the land where graves barely held the restless. I followed the sound, a low, guttural vibration that seemed to pulse from the iron clasps themselves. The shackles of silence I had upheld began to break. I thought of Father's final warnings, of Mother's letters trembling with dread, of the watchers whose prayers had echoed hollow in the dark. And then the terrible clarity dawned. The box's purpose was not just to contain, but to communicate. An agonized plea, a warning in a language half forgotten by time. In the dim glow of the attic lamp, I found something new beneath the box, etched into the floorboards, runes forming a seal older than anything I had known. My breath hitched as realization cut through me. The box was a lock. Yes, but also a key. The lock to hold something at bay, the key to unleash what had been imprisoned. Every part of this night spoke of finality. Then, abruptly, the floor beneath me gave way. A hidden trapdoor I had not known existed, opening like a maw to swallow me whole. I descended into a crypt of silence. The chamber was a vault of dread, stone walls slick with damp and shadow. In the center, a pit gaped wide, swirling with brittle bones and relics of sacrifices long past. Here lay not only the history of curses, but the living heart of darkness itself, pulsing and desperate to be free. Scraps of parchment bound with rusted wire littered the floor, scrawled with frantic entries from those who had tried and failed to resist the pact. Jeremiah's name appeared repeatedly, but alongside it was another, Silas Thorne. The occultist who vanished had not disappeared. I understood now. He had crossed the threshold, become something else. A vessel to the darkness I faced. My father's pact was a desperate thread holding the town, my family, and me from complete oblivion. But as I sank further, the weight of despair mounted. Light dimmed to a sickly hue, and shadows began to stretch and breathe, coiling in corners like waiting snakes. A sound rose in the room, a low chant, vibrating from unseen throats. A call to open the box, to welcome the darkness. Faces flickered at the edges of vision, my father's, mother's, and Clara's, each twisted by torment, pleading and condemning simultaneously. A foul wind stirred the chamber's stale air, carrying voices that cut through my mind like razors. They spoke of blood, of sacrifice, of a debt owed since the foundation of Ashborough itself. I felt hands, cold and heavy, grip my soul. I stumbled backward, heart thrashing, and the walls seemed to close, the chanting growing louder, faster, suffocating. And in that moment, a terrible understanding: the price was never just sacrifice, but submission. The Mallory line was bound by their choice to guard a door to hell. The box was the seal, the bloodline the lock-pick. I realized how many had fallen before me, destroyed by the torment, cracked under the weight of watching and waiting. No sooner had the thought settled than a terrible creak split the chamber. The heavy iron door at the top of the stairs was closing, sealing me in a vault of endless night. Panic rose like poison in my veins, while the whispering turned to laughter. Horrid and hollow, the box remained above me, the ravenous heartbeat of the estate beating in time with my own faltering pulse. And yet, despite the suffocating darkness, and the voices begging me to surrender, I refused. To open the box now would be to doom not only myself, but Ashborough and all the innocent lives tangled in this web. The entity beneath was no mere wraith. but an ancient intelligence bound by human folly and desperation. It had twisted decades of sacrifice into a cage of torment. But the cage was breaking. My own blood was the last tether holding it back. Somewhere in that swirling madness, I found a shard of memory, a phrase Father had repeated in delirium: to break is to unleash the void. The void would swallow all. Just then, a subtle shift in the shadows. Something moved at the edge of sight. A figure robed in tattered darkness, eyes like drowning stars. It approached silently, and I recognized the presence. The sentinel named only in fractured texts. The guardian my family was bound to keep imprisoned, and yet haunted by. Its mouth opened not to speak, but to sigh a flame of sorrow and hunger. It was not evil by nature, but corrupted by centuries of blood and despair. Its touch would burn light into darkness, or unravel reality altogether. The sentinel reached toward me, hands stretching wider and wider, breath spreading like frost across my skin. I backed away, heart hammering against a cage of bones, and slammed the door shut just as the ancient lock bit into place with a final clatter that echoed through the crypt. Silence returned, but it was a fragile thing, like the brittle wings of a trapped crow. I panted in the gloom, feeling the weight of 1,000 whispered fates pressing down. I could not linger here longer, but as I climbed out, I thought of the box perched in the attic, the source and prison of all this madness. Every instinct screamed not to open it, but a voice deeper than fear whispered that the truth behind this was even darker than the curses. The blood spilled in desperate hope. Outside that chamber, I pored over the last of Father's journals once more, and discovered the most dreadful entry yet. One written in a hand unsteady and wild, yet knowing beyond the grave. He spoke plainly of the entity's true name, a word so old and tangled in meaning it defied human tongues. This name was the essence of the void itself, the final darkness that no covenant or blood tether could forever hold. The box was a compendium, a prison for that name, a safeguard against naming the unnameable lest it unravel the very strands of reality. Father's journal ended abruptly, mid-sentence, with the scrawl of 3 words chilling in their simplicity. It waits still. At that point I must pause and speak plainly. The journey through this darkness has been exhausting, harrowing, and at times unbearable. I am deeply grateful to every single one of you who has stayed with me this far into the story. The ghastly journal has been demonetized, and these videos earn no income. Yet it is your trust and your listening that keep these stories alive. If you feel moved to support the channel, there is a Ko-Fi link in this video's description and on the channel page. Even buying me a coffee makes a genuine difference, allowing this work to continue despite the silence of advertisers and the shadow of shadowed histories. I thank you from the bottom of my heart for walking into this darkness with me. And now, with heavy breath and a restless mind, we return to uncover what fate has yet to reveal. The last nights have been a blur of restless dreams and whispered voices, each one layering a poison of dread deeper into my thoughts. The town of Ashboro has always been a cage, but now it felt like a crucible pressing in on me from all sides. The local constable's warnings had escalated. He told me of others wanting the box, of secret factions bent on its destruction or misuse. The Watchers, once protectors, had fragmented into factions, some demanding the box's destruction, others craving to command the darkness it contained. I learned that the pack's power had seeped into the blood itself. Each Mallory sacrificed not just flesh, but the soul's freedom, marked as guardian and prisoner alike. Desperation clawed at me as shadows began manifesting fully. One evening, as I stood in the parlor, the box moved, sliding closer, emitting a low hum of desperate power. The glyphs on its surface pulsed rhythmically, almost like a heartbeat growing louder, begging for release. The temperature dropped, breath misting before me, and a figure shimmered within the warped glass of an old mirror, my father. Or the shadow of him. Eyes reflecting the same torment I felt. And then came the final crushing revelation: the pact had never been a hollow curse, but a grotesque bargaining with an ancient force that fed on human memory and suffering, stealing years from each guardian's life and eroding their sanity. The bloodline had been a slow sacrifice, generation by generation, fading into madness to keep the entity chained. And now I was the last. The box, it seemed, also held a ledger of futures, twisted visions scribbled in the margins of father's writings, where the very end of our bloodline was foretold. An inevitable breaking of the seal, the shattering of all that remained between order and utter oblivion. I felt the abyss touch my mind, the temptation to open, to know, to understand. A whisper grew inside me, coaxing, promising relief from the endless watchfulness I had borne since childhood. The midnight oil burned low. The house moaned with the sound of unseen chains. Within the box was a darkness older than the family who built it, older than the village, older than the stones beneath my feet. And yet the box held more than darkness. It was a mirror, reflecting the fear, the guilt, the sacrifices masked beneath generations of pride. The heart of darkness was not merely a thing imprisoned, but the bleeding soul of my family's legacy, a sorrow that clawed with every breath. Just as I gathered strength to turn away, resolve hardening in my bones, the house plunged into silence. A silence so absolute it broke like a scream. The attic door creaked open slowly on its own, the box illuminated by a single sliver of moonlight that pierced the gloom like silver venom. And from the opened box, a small cold wind rose, carrying the faintest scent of decay and wildflowers, the scent of both ending and beginning. I stepped back, heart thunderous and mind fracturing, standing before the unthinkable choice, wrought by centuries of blood and silence. To open the box and face the horror unleashed, or to live forever under the crushing weight of waiting. The room seemed to pulse, breath joining mine in a dreadful dance. Time stretched thin as the house leaned closer, whispering that the final truth was not beyond the lock, but within the lock itself, waiting to be freed or to consume. The shadows gathered, and I realized the watchers were no longer mere whispers. They were witnessing, waiting for the sealing or the undoing. This was the heart of darkness, the moment before the inevitable dawn or eternal night. Welcome back to the Ghastly Journal, where we uncover truths too dire for daylight. And tonight, the final chapter arrives, an ending and yet an opening into shadows that will claw at your thoughts long after the screen fades to black. The attic was quiet but heavy, the box resting there like a heart of iron, waiting to be wrenched free from centuries of silence. I stood over it, hands trembling with the burden of what that revealed led to: an ancient sentinel bound by blood, by death, by the desperate sacrifices of every Mallory before me. The entity that had once protected Ashborough, now mangled and twisted by time and suffering, waiting for one last key to either bind it anew or unlock a doom too vast for human reckoning. The choice was mine, and yet it felt less a choice and more the inevitable force of my birthright, pulling me forward like the tide claiming the shore. As lightning struck the sky above, I reached for the box's clasp, cold as drying flesh beneath my fingertips. The iron carvings pulsed with a rhythm not unlike a trapped heartbeat. That slow, relentless thump echoing through the old house and into my very bones. But then a voice, unmistakable but not spoken aloud, shattered the silence. Not my father's, but a chorus of all who had borne this curse. Warnings tangled with pleas and curses, heavy as the damp earth beneath. To open the box would unleash either salvation or annihilation. and the line between the two had blurred beyond distinction. I hesitated, then slowly lifted the lid. Darkness poured forth like a living thing, a tendril of shadow that slipped past the edge of the box and coiled into the cold night air. But inside lay no monstrous creature, no swirling chaos as my mind had imagined, but a mirror, a cracked antique glass framed by the same runes that marked the box. In its depths, I saw not my reflection, but a tapestry of faces, ancestors whose eyes held infinite sorrow, lovers lost, children vanished, all bound in a golden thread woven through time and sacrifice. And at the very center was a figure shrouded in turmoil, the sentinel, not a monster, not a god, but the embodiment of a terrible duty. In that moment, the house seemed to breathe with me, the walls cracking and groaning, as if this revelation had broken an unseen chain. The spirit whispered that the box was never meant to be opened until the last guard fell. The bloodline's final promise to hold the darkness at bay. Each Mallory had chained themselves willingly, fracturing their minds, surrendering their futures, so this entity would not walk free. And now I stood at the cusp. The pendulum faltered. To close the box was to continue the cycle, to accept my fate as warden in an unending vigil of solitude and fear. To open it meant risking the world, letting loose the sentinel's true form, the primal chaos it was birthed to contain. The voice from the shadows was not a command, but a lament, filled with centuries of regret and longing for freedom, but with a knowing that freedom could only come through destruction. Deep inside, I felt the pull of exhaustion, the weariness of a lifetime spent in dread and uncertainty. The choice seemed cruel and inevitable. I closed the box slowly, the mirror's surface capturing a final glimpse of that tormented sentinel, before slipping back into darkness. The weight of history settled back into the worn wood and iron clasps, but I knew nothing had ended, only paused. The watchers in the fringes remained silent but watchful, their eyes glimmering in the corners of my vision. Faint whispers folding into the cold night air. Returning the box to its rightful place on the floorboards, I secured it as my father had done, feeling the jagged edge of hope and despair entwined beneath the seal. Leaving the attic, the house exhaled once, a low mournful groan echoing through the beams, as if mourning the burden passed to me. In the days that followed, Ashborough returned to its uneasy calm. The oppressive presence that had weighed on my shoulders lingered, a shadow tethered to the box and the blood that bound it. The mansion stood, a solemn monument to a family legacy balanced precariously between protection and destruction. I found myself wandering the grounds in the quiet hours, beneath the ancient oaks whose twisted limbs still whispered secrets no one dared admit aloud. I understood now that the horrors were not confined to the house or the box. They lived in the hearts and minds of those who bore the Mallory name, a lineage cursed and blessed by their choice to guard the threshold between worlds. At times, the echoes of the past surfaced, shapes flickering in the peripheral vision, soft voices that brushed the edges of sleep, and the cold scent of rust and earth that clung to the evening air. Friends and neighbors noticed my withdrawal, the way I seemed to carry a weight they could neither see nor understand. Marjorie Wells reached out once, her eyes clouded with worry, but I only shook my head, aware she bore her own burdens as one of the watchers. The town itself seemed to hush around me. The stories I uncovered folded back into silence like a wound stitched too tightly. In this quiet, the philosophical truth of my inheritance settled deep. Some evils are not vanquished by sword or flame, but sustained through sacrifice and silence. The Mallorys had bartered their humanity to hold the darkness at bay, and in doing so had blurred the lines between horror and heroism. Yet, I could not shake the lingering question. Was the sentinel truly a guardian, or merely another form of the nightmare? The nature of evil is rarely simple. Often, it wears the guise of salvation, and salvation can become damnation in a single breath. As I sat in the parlor one evening, the shadows lengthening into a tangle of black vines over the faded wallpaper, the box hummed faintly beneath the floor. I felt eyes watching. Not human, not entirely spectral either, but ancient and patient. The watchers were still there, unseen, waiting, hoping that the bloodline would not falter. I touched the box gingerly, the cold iron chill running like a whisper through my bones. A sudden gust flickered the candle flames and carried a voice. A barely audible warning. Or perhaps a promise that the reckoning was not over. Somewhere beneath the earth, the sentinel stirred, constrained by the fragile bonds of blood and oath, biding time until the next guardian faltered. The horror I faced had no neat end, no closing chapter. It was a living thing, a cycle woven into the fabric of Ashboro, as natural and terrifying as the creeping mists that rolled in from the valley each morning. And so, I remained the last Mallory, the unwilling warden of a secret that could unmake reality itself. The box waits, as I do, held back by iron will and ancestral sacrifice, but forever poised to release the darkness that lurks beneath the veneer of this small, forgotten town. I encourage you now, if you have journeyed this far, to look carefully at the shadows in your own homes, the silent places where the past weighs heaviest. Some doors should never be opened, some boxes left locked, and some legacies born alone. Thank you for sharing this story, the story of a bloodline caught between salvation and oblivion. If this tale has held you in thrall, remember to like and subscribe to the Ghastly Journal, where the darkest secrets find their voice, and the past never truly lets go.